Hello and welcome to another episode of the Employee to Boss podcast. I'm your host, Hayleigh Hayhurst, the owner of Espresso Podcast Production. Today, I'm coming at you with a solo episode all about podcast burnout. More specifically, how to avoid it. So I know from hearing from my clients or people with podcasts or just people in my network, it can be hard to keep up with your podcast, especially as the year wraps up. I feel like this time of year, we're looking at our incomes, we're looking at our money-making tasks, and it's really easy to, put things off on the back burner. It's also the time that a lot of us want to start relaxing. It's summer. We want to be outside in the sun. I'm in Seattle, and if you know anything about Seattle, it's known as a rainy city. So it's definitely, the summertime is the time that people really take time off of work and want to get out there and have fun. And one of the things that I notice from people with podcasts is this is the time of year that podcasting becomes more difficult. And this is the time of year that people start getting burnt out. And this episode is all about 4 ways to avoid podcast burnout. So, podcasting is amazing for business. I'm going to do another solo episode about this soon, about why I believe every business owner should have a podcast. It's amazing for visibility. It's amazing for sharing your story, your mission, your voice. If you are client-facing, like you work one-on-one with clients or you have group coaching or sell courses, your podcast is an incredible way for you to make more connections and let people know actually who you are. And I think that if your podcast is not making you money through advertisements or things like that, that's really when, during this time of year, honestly, this could happen any time of year, if you don't see a direct ROI from it, you can be like, oh, okay, this can wait, this can go off on the back burner. But honestly, once you have a podcast and you are building your network, building your listeners, you don't want to take too much time off because they can go find another podcast. I always say this, there's 2 million podcasts out there. Like, you have to show your audience why they should come to yours, why they should listen to yours. And really, these people who are listening to your shows are coming to you because they like you. They like the way you speak. They like the ideas that you have. If you do interviews, they love the guests you have. They love the way that you interview. And so taking time off, months off, weeks off, it's really not the best thing to do if you can avoid it. Of course, there's situations that, if you're going on a long trip, we'll talk about this. But if you're like, if you need to take time off, you can, but if you can avoid it, that's what this episode is about. This episode is all about how you can avoid that podcast burnout. So my first tip for you is what I require every single one of my clients to do. When I have someone who wants to work with me, I tell them, okay, you need to get your episodes to me 2 weeks in advance. That way, if I'm busy one week, we're good. If you are busy one week, we're good. We always have a buffer. So the next 2 weeks, I am traveling a lot. I'm going back home for a little bit, and I have recorded 3 episodes that are already edited and scheduled and are just going to go up. So all I have to do is the marketing. So my tip for you is to prepare your episodes at least 2 weeks in advance, sometimes longer if possible. Now, I know there's situations where this is not possible, like if you have a timely podcast like politics, news, and sports. This one is a little bit harder, but for my clients, since I work with business owners and entrepreneurs and people who typically have business or similar podcasts who are conducting interviews, it's a lot easier for us to just batch record and then schedule it out in advance. You can even schedule out your marketing in advance as well with the use of something like later.com, where you can schedule your posts, or there's a ton of social media schedulers out there. So that's my tip for you. Prepare your episodes in advance, create your marketing graphics when you have time, and so when you're traveling or something comes up, you are prepared. For my clients, we are always 2 weeks in advance. Even for myself, I'm 2 weeks in advance of my episodes. That way, like I said, when I'm traveling, I don't have to think about it. All I have to do is download the posts that I've already created on Canva and just post them. And that way I'm not missing any weeks, I'm not missing any content, and my audience is always refreshed with some new podcast episodes. That way you don't have to go find someone else to listen to on those long car rides. So that's my first tip. My second tip, this one takes some, you're going to have to think about this. You're going to have to really sit down, and if this isn't top of mind, you need to do this ASAP. Remember your why and figure out your why. Why are you doing this podcast? Why are you covering these topics? Why are you putting out this content for your audience to listen to? Why are you doing this? Just in general, why are you podcasting? What is making you want to do this? And that will keep you motivated. If you can't think of your why, if I say, why do you have a podcast? And you're like, I'm not sure. Okay, let's think about this, because if you don't know why you're doing it and you don't have your long-term goals in mind, you will get burnt out. Definitely. In fact, the first thing that my clients and I work on in my one-on-one coaching program is their short-term goals and their long-term goals, because both of these feed into the way that you promote your podcast. If your goal is to be on Oprah, I don't know. If your goal is literally to be on Oprah, okay? The way that we would market that is going to be different than someone's goal who is to put out 100 episodes and not focus on listenership, right? If your goal is to make $1 million from your podcast, your marketing strategy is going to be different than someone whose goal is to book 2 clients in a year, right? Like, it's going to be different goals for different things. And so once you understand your why, you can also think about your short-term goals and long-term goals and really map it out. I recommend mapping this out pretty early on in your podcast career. And if you're really not sure, that's totally okay. You can book a strategy call with me on my website, and I will walk you through this all. We'll talk about it. I'll ask you deep questions. You'll think, and we'll work it out together. But I really, really, really recommend understanding why you're actually podcasting. So that's my second tip. Know your why. My third tip is figure out what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy, and then outsource what you don't enjoy. Podcast editing, anyone could do it. Okay, I'm a podcast editor. This is my full-time job, and I know it's very uncommon for people to really be like, oh yeah, anyone could do my job. While not anyone could do my job in the way that I do it, anyone can figure out how to edit a podcast in some way. But the reason that my clients typically work with me is because, number one, they don't like podcast editing. Number two, they're not very good at podcast editing. Number three, they don't have time to do their podcast editing. And number four, I just do it quicker and better, and then they can figure out other things in their business like marketing or running their business, since I work with entrepreneurs. They see the value in their podcast and they don't want to go a week without it, but they know doing it themselves, they will not hold themselves accountable to it. They will let weeks go by that they're not putting out episodes, and then when they finally have time to do it, they've lost a lot of their listeners. And so if podcast editing is what's holding you back from actually putting out a podcast, it may be time to make that investment. If podcast marketing is what's holding you back, it may be time to make that investment in someone like me who does editing, marketing, strategy, all of those things. To be completely transparent, in my business, there's things that I don't enjoy doing. I do not love growing my Facebook group, so I have outsourced that. And I have an incredible assistant who helps me grow my Facebook community, and she is an amazing blessing because I know I wouldn't do it myself. You know, there's things in business that you just will not feel talented at, and there's things in business that you will just not feel inspired by. And I always think if you're doing something and you need to take a nap after it, you shouldn't be doing it, right? Like if you have to send out like an email for email marketing and you're like, oh my God, okay, this is my only task today and then I'm done, maybe you should outsource it. Same with podcasting. If you put out an episode and you're like, next week I have to do another one, it may be time to outsource that as well. So I know outsourcing and spending money, especially when your podcast maybe isn't making money, can be scary, but you can do so many other things. One of my clients, she was spending about 8 hours a week on her podcast to put out literally one episode a week. And when she hired me, she was able to take those 8 hours and put it into her real estate business or her podcast marketing. Since we started working together, she has grown so all I do is her editing, right? And she has been able to grow her podcast community. She's been able to hit 10,000 downloads on her podcast. And this is all because now she has time to actually put effort outside of editing into her podcast. When you start a podcast, you have to do so many things. You have to market it or you won't have the listeners that you want. You have to do all of these things. And so she's been able to start a YouTube, a TikTok. She's been able to create so many more graphics for her podcast and grow her other business as well. So really think about the time that you can use differently if you outsource your podcast editing, marketing, or strategy. Now, the last thing that goes with this a little bit is if you are not feeling inspired by your podcast, if you are struggling to put out episodes, it may be time to rebrand, refocus, revamp, or relax. So, a little backstory on Employee to Boss podcast. When I was first launching my podcast, I was finding a lot of my listeners on Facebook or Instagram or through my other connections, and they were just like, oh, you should interview this person. And I was like, sure, like I'm about to launch this podcast. I need some new people to interview. But these were people I didn't really know. And they're good episodes, but there was no follow-up afterwards. Like we would do the interview and then we were over. That was it. And I was feeling really burnt out about it. And so if you look back, I launched season 2 just a couple episodes ago. And now I'm interviewing my friends, my clients, actual connections that I've made through my business that I want to deepen. So I'm using my podcast to deepen my connections, deepen my relationships with my friends, my clients, just people I've met through my 2 years of business. And it has been so much fun. So if you are not feeling your podcast anymore, maybe it's time to get some new artwork, some new music, maybe rename your podcast even. That's a little harder. We can talk about it if you want. But there's just so many new things that you can do with your podcast. Change maybe your goal, niche, whatever it is. When you write out your long-term goals, maybe you're going to realize that what you're doing currently isn't aligned. And it is totally okay to rebrand, refocus, and revamp. It is totally fine, especially when you have a strategy behind it. So again, book a strategy call with me and I will help you through all of this. You can book that on my website. So these are my 4 tips on avoiding podcast burnout. Number 1 is to prepare your episodes at least 2 weeks in advance. Number 2 is to remember your why. Number 3 is to figure out what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy and maybe outsource what you don't love. And then the last thing is to rebrand, revamp, and refocus if you are not feeling inspired by your show anymore. So I hope that this helps you. I don't want you to give up on your podcast. I do not want you to quit. I want you to keep going, but I want you to love it. So come connect with me on Instagram. It is Espresso Podcast Production. You can also find my Facebook group. It is Espresso Growth for podcasters, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders. I share tons of free podcast tips and tricks in there. It's also just an incredible community of podcasters. So we are almost at 600 members who all have podcasts. Some of them are looking for guests, and some of them are just looking for friends who also have podcasts. I think it's really incredible to grow this community, and I'm having so much fun with it. And you can also check out my website, espressopodcastproduction.com. All will be down in the show notes. So thank you for listening to this week's solo episode, and I will be back next week with another interview episode. Thank you for listening to the Employee to Boss podcast. If you made it to the end of this episode, I hope that you implement the actionable steps from this week's experts so you can get started with your business today. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the Employee to Boss podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It helps more than you could ever imagine. Remember, a little progress each day leads to big results. We come out with a new episode every Tuesday. To access our show notes, transcripts, and courses, please check out espressopodcastproduction.com.